Hey everybody, this is Tim from Tim and Fran versus the Man. I'm Tim.
And I'm Fran.
So today we wanted to talk about the recent murder of George Floyd by the Minneapolis State Police.
And yeah, we're going to be talking about sort of the murder itself and the aftermath, since, it's been a couple of weeks now and we've seen unrest really spread really from Minneapolis and its suburbs to the country and now globally. And we're going to be talking about some concerning developments and hopeful developments in this broader movement. But I think a good place to start is just sort of a review of, what's currently known about the murder itself. And so on the evening of May 25th, Officer Derek Chauvin, a white cop in Minneapolis, stood on George Floyd's neck for approximately 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And there's just more and more gruesome details sort of coming out about the police officer's actions. And I think one of them that was most troubling was that, you had medical personnel in the area actually asking the officer to remove his knee from Mr. Floyd's neck about 6 minutes into the actual murder itself, and he still refused to do so. And so, this, combined with people being locked down for 3 months, has led to a fresh wave of anger against police departments. And now it's sort of turned into a general anti-police, anti-state movement in some regards. But there's also some other developments that are quite concerning. Let's see, am I missing anything about the initial sort of murder of George Floyd here? Because that's pretty much what I've heard.
The other thing about it that's also fairly disturbing is that 3 fellow officers sort of stood by and allowed this to happen. Right. And I would say there's some other details that they're attempting to bring up that I find mildly disturbing, like the fact that they're attempting to say, like, George Floyd was on drugs at the time and other things, basically attempting to, in a sly way, like, try to justify the murder, even though I think most rational people at this point would classify this as a murder rather than like some sort of accident.
Right.
Because they're attempting to use the sort of that he took drugs as justification. But I think thankfully this time I would say that only like the most fervent people who people who go off about the thin blue line and only those like crazy type of people, like almost like extreme, like I guess you would call them bootlickers, are the only they're really the only type of people defending this death at this time. Right.
And I mean, the night where the protests really flared up in the Minneapolis area, you even had sort of the Boogaloo crew come out and, they weren't in support of the business owners in the area. Instead, they wanted to actually support the protesters. And I remember kind of excitedly calling you saying, oh, look, we have left-right unity, we have racial unity going on. And since then, it seems like this movement's been directed in a way to try to make it more racially divisive. At one point, I saw a picture on social media that was basically saying, like, we have to defend the rights of all free men, regardless of their creed or, like, skin color. And that was posted by a group of 3%ers in the Minnesota, like, sort of their state chapter. And so, to me, it seemed as though, right off the bat, this was a case where it would be very difficult to make it about, like, race, to make it about, make it something more than what the underlying story is here, and that is men and women of all colors against the state's brutality. And of course some police departments do have a history of racism, you can't deny that, but I really think for once the country for at least a couple of days before this movement's now been since hijacked by like social engineers and creeps, there was a sense of it's all of us versus the police department. Everyone's had a pretty negative, a negative experience with the police at one point in their life, and that was really sort of a rallying cry.
Yeah, and I definitely saw that as well, and I think that for once it was like a very positive development, because essentially the entire country was on the side of George Floyd, whereas usually what you see is like people on the right tend to defend the police officer, and then people on the left tend to defend the citizen, but then of course they make it like they automatically jump towards a racial issue and attempt to make it completely about race. And I was actually thinking about a bigger picture to all of this. This is actually sort of how you kind of saw the initial radicalization of the right and left, was the early police killings, going back to Michael Brown and Eric Garner. I think, who was the third one? Was that Freddie Gray?
Freddie Gray in Baltimore, yeah.
Right, and I was actually thinking the media, essentially, their tactic, as we've discussed before, has been sort of only reporting on the police essentially killing black men, and whenever a white person, or even like a Latin person or an Asian person is killed, you kind of by the police, you kind of hear radio silence from the media, or if they do cover it, it's very sparse. They don't report on it much, and I think that it's important to sort of analyze that as it almost seems to me like a tactic to get the public to focus almost entirely on the racial issue, rather than the larger issue of actually reforming the police department, getting rid of victimless crime laws, breaking up police unions, things that would actually potentially help.
Right.
But the problem is that when you have it completely based on race and not on the police brutality, a lot of the time, well, you can just yell about racism for a while, and then the entire issue goes away. It sort of inflames irritation from right-wingers who, they don't really like, because they see it as sort of an attack on white people in a way. And I think in certain ways it is, in certain ways it isn't. I think that some of the BLM people are are legitimately attempting to fight police brutality, and they legitimately believe that they're doing something good. And I just think that oftentimes it is hijacked by some more nefarious forces who are attempting to make it a race issue on purpose a lot of the time.
Yeah, and I guess before we go deeper into this, the hijacking of the movement, you go back to the early days of this when this first spread nationally, and you have a lot of people critiquing, they were looting businesses, and it's like in a lot of cases they directed their anger and violence directly at state buildings. And so just a few examples you had, obviously the state media apparatus known as CNN, after a day of police trying to reason with protesters, there was just such a fury that the protesters actually ended up storming CNN and like igniting fireworks in like their lobby. And, in like areas like Ohio, they were storming like state capitals and smashing government buildings and stuff. So, in my mind, I was like, well, here's like genuine anti-state rage. You have to think about it. People have lost their jobs. They've been locked away for 3 months due to a virus that, initially almost fooled me when I was initially tracking it, and now it's looking less and less contagious. It's looking less and less deadly. People from all walks of life have been affected by arguably one of the biggest policy blunders in human history. And so you genuinely saw a fertile, sort of anti-state movement, and I think what happened was, the powers that be saw this, and they saw the ferocity of it, the open, brutal violence of it all, and, the willingness of protesters to really take these giant risks, putting their bodies actually in front of police and throwing projectiles and stuff, and now they're like, well, it's a race issue, let's put it on social media, let's commodify this revolution. And not like, I don't mean to argue that in sort of like a Marxonian, like, oh, capitalism always commodifies revolutions, but I mean, like, it literally happened. Like, we have a social engineering apparatus, via social media, via these tech giants working with the state, and they said, what's something that we've gotten the people really, angry about over the last few years? Oh, it's racism. So let's make this entire movement, which was really a grassroots expression of anger that started from a single police killing to, it enraged every group, as we said, from the far right to the far left. And now it's like, let's make this about race. Let's narrow the goals of this movement. And so now what you see are cities and police officers like conceding to these quote unquote like, pro diversity policies and pro diversity actions, and some examples, they have like renaming streets like Black Lives Matter Plaza and things like that. It's like, for 80% of the movement, they're going to go home after that. You're like, we won, we tore down a 300-year-old bronze statue. We won, we virtue signaled and won. And, it's just really sad to see an organic movement start, which was occasionally violent, and suddenly it's put in that box of, well, it's racism, and now it's basically controlled opposition and cringy. And, the same dynamic's going to take place. You're just going to, you're going to have protesters and groups that aren't really stirring the pot. They're kind of playing into this broader divide and conquer agenda, and you're going to have the same old crap, I guess is really what frustrates me. And, we've seen the movement again, as I've said, go from a really legit expression of anger to, this orchestrated psyop in a way.
Yeah, I think what you've really seen here, I think what you've really seen here the entire time has been a bunch of different groups attempting to piggyback off of the initial anger, and justifiably so, against police brutality and a militarized police state. So what you kind of saw is the big government and corporations and like the police, okay, well, they don't really want to give up their prison industrial complex because corporations profit off of it, the government profits off of it, and the cops don't really want to reform either. A lot of them could get fired. So you kind of saw them doing is attempting to purposefully stoke the flames of the riots.
Right. And sorry.
Yeah. But also other groups seem to be piggybacking on this movement as well. You had the far left, who saw this basically as a chance to attempt to instate communism or something, like that. They think that it's 1917 Russia, like they're Bolsheviks, and this is like the glorious, like the Great Leap Forward or something. They say. Well,
we have a 4-block Soviet Union in Seattle now. They've taken over and formed the autonomous zone, which within a single day they're begging for food and supplies, because this thing doesn't generally work very well. If you look at like the Paris Commune in the late 1800s, they had to like resort to eating zoo animals, and these types of things don't generally work.
Yeah, I think they invited some homeless people in, and the homeless people ate all their food, right? What, at least that's what I heard.
Right, the initial reports. So, I was going to piggyback off of some of the things that you said, though, about how, this rage has been capitalized on by some, nefarious groups. You see in dozens of major cities and via posts on social media, there's just piles of bricks, just like poorly wrapped, and they're nowhere near sites of construction. And I've heard this from dozens of different social media accounts, and people, of course, are, using these bricks to throw at officers and throw in businesses and, things like that. So it's just, there's very clearly, an outside force trying to play upon this anger, trying to, take this anger and form it into, some kind of a way to advance changes they would like to see, and I'm talking about people like Soros. I'm talking about, some of these sort of these big freaky social controllers that really, people aren't really talking about.
Yeah, it definitely could. I think that they're definitely involved. A lot of this stuff also could technically be being engineered by left-wing activists, or also even white nationalists who want to see sort of more chaos, so that mainline America, becomes more afraid of, like, the scary black people, and they're gonna come and, all the sort of stereotypes, like,
someone's gonna make a soundbite out of that, like.
Yeah, of course. And now they're gonna try to, like, be like Tim Bajorek, evil white nationalist racist, or some stupid shit like that. But the problem is that you do have all these groups attempting to use this, attempting to use these riots and attempting to stoke the riots for their own gains.
Right.
You kind of see, like, that there was that video of that, like, strange guy who was just, like, breaking windows, and you just see the body language. He just looks so awkward and, like, out of place. He doesn't really seem like he's, like, down with the cause. It seems like he's, like, trying to, like, break stuff and then, like, get out because that's, like, his mission or something.
Right, and the guy who confronted him was actually revealed to be, they call him, like, the pizza box guy. You had, like, I've heard widely different reports. Some people say he was, like, an undercover officer trying to incite further violence. Other people have said he's a member of Antifa. But basically, in the video, he's, like, confronted by a man with, like, a box of pizza or something. And it turns out that guy with the box of pizza is actually, like, a friend of his, and, like, there's pictures of them just, like, hanging out together. And, and I guess, like, another thing to really talk about, because this is really happening all so fast, I remember calling you, Tim, and being like, this could be like that collapse we've been talking about, but I don't think it's quite that yet, but it's definitely like a big, a big shudder, a pre-shock, before the major earthquake. But I think another alarming development was the designation of Antifa as a terrorist group. As much as I don't necessarily respect their ideology and tactics, the state weaponizing sort of the military apparatus through, like, Department of Homeland Security, against any group is something that's alarming. And so now, as a result of that, we're, instead of, different groups saying, well, that was wrong, and, we should stand for any kind of cause of liberty, you have the left now asking to have people who are connected to Confederate, pro-Confederacy groups labeled as terrorists, so the state is literally making us point at each other and go, terrorist, designate him, designate her, designate them, designate their tribe, not my tribe, though. My tribe's good, my tribe's great, And it's just a very dangerous game that we're playing.
Green gang and purple gang, basically.
Right.
But the Trump coming in and labeling Antifa a terrorist organization, and now you're right. They're now trying to, like, ban the Confederate flag from all from the military, and it is very disturbing, because I don't think that people are really noticing it in a way, but it very much seems that the state apparatus has, like, found this, like, perfect way in which to basically start censoring the radicals of both sides, and I think that both of them are really walking into a really, dangerous territory without realizing it, because, and then you're getting the right-wingers were totally on board, and they're like, yeah, we gotta get rid of those Antifa terrorists, and we gotta get the National Guard in there to shoot them dead, like that kind of ethos. And then now, because the right wing, like, did that, and like the left wing is coming back and being like, well, like the Confederate flag isn't very, politically correct, so we should get rid of it from the military. So there's these kind of like, and I think that it's really not a good idea, because what you're literally doing is you're suppressing your nation's like radical voices, who, obviously I don't agree with the alt-right or the radical left. Like, I find them both like repugnant in their own ways, but if you attempt to suppress them, one, it allows for the state to basically attempt to start suppressing more and more voices who are considered fringe. Like, I know that they're attempting to kind of like sew in this idea that the Boogaloo guys are dangerous, even though mostly what they were doing was just like either, peacefully protesting or defending people's businesses from rioters. And, you could start seeing more peaceful, like, quote-unquote, radicals censored from this. But the other thing is, perhaps even more dangerously, is that when you start censoring radical voices, you actually attempt to make their ideas look essentially sexier. Like, it's like, ooh, well, they're getting banned, like, maybe I should join that cool, like, radical underground kind of movement. It's like, yeah, well, you don't want to make fascism and, like, communism look sexier. That's not a good idea.
Exactly. I think you brought up a lot of good points there, and I kind of lost track of my thoughts there for a second, but let's see. Did you want to talk more about the Seattle, like, commune and what's going on there as well, and how that kind of relates to what you were just saying, making these ideas seem more sexy?
I think the Seattle Autonomous Zone seems... The problem is that I know their heart's in the right place, and, like, I think that we would both agree that, for the most part, we support, like, we'll support most anarchists of any flavor as long as they're not, like doing...
Tankies.
Well, tankies aren't really anarchists. Those guys are fucking crazy. Well, I mean, I guess technically the goal is eventually anarchy, but they're basic. Those are big government communists. Right. Yeah.
Anarchy with force. And then I think another thing that we'll do it like some editing and post just to show you guys sort of how they got this sort of racial narrative going, is there was a picture online of an African American business owner defending his storefront alongside like two, white guys, people from the Boogaloo. And I initially showed Tim this, and it was the three of them in the same picture, and then he sent me like a New York Post article that was released like minutes later, and like the black guy was cropped out, and it was just like the two white guys, and it was like they called them like a team of rednecks, or what did they say again? It was like,
it was like they kept on referring to them as like these like two redneck guys, and then it was actually like they're two like there were two black friends actually. Like the picture I had was like it was still cropping one of them out for some reason, but you noticed there was this it was pretty creepy because apparently there were a few like more underground kind of, well, not exactly underground, it's sort of like the underground of like the mainstream media, so sort of like almost like tabloid journalism.
Mm-hmm.
But you kind of saw a bunch of these rags like basically censoring out the fact that two black people were defending the storefront with the two white guys, to almost like kind of push this weird narrative that like, oh well, you know, white people defend businesses and, you know, black people are the rioters. And it was sort of very strange. Like, I think it's a really good example of how like the media kind of works on people to sort of push certain narratives about different groups of people, but you know, in the end it was actually like, you know, four just guys like protecting businesses during the rioting.
Right.
And then I think you had you were showing me some videos of a lot of guys like standing out and defending businesses, and like all the guys there were like black as well.
Yeah.
So like it definitely kind of, I guess, fights that sort of that narrative that they're trying to instill in people.
Right. And it's sort of like the perfect example of the ANCAP argument. You know, a lot of ANCOMs are like, well, ANCAPs are racist, and not to make this like an AN v AN, because honestly we all want the same thing, just different flavors of it, but you know, I hear like a common critique of the ANCAPs is like, oh, you guys are racist, you wouldn't want black people to have guns, and it's like, that's exactly what we want. You know, we want them to be able to defend themselves against, you know, whether it be the state or an angry mob, or, you know, because some people in the mobs that we've seen have been white supremacists just trying to egg people on to really bring that protest to that next level of violence, you know, and and you get people to beg to get these, you know, quote unquote like wild animals out of the street or whatever, you know, the language of yesterday or of the white nationalists would be. And you know, these protests, they've spread now to the suburbs, and actually we attended one in, you know, suburban Connecticut. Mm-hmm. And you know, it was an interesting dynamic that developed. We had an old friend from middle school, you know, I don't want to name his name, but you know, and this is to say nothing bad about him, but he was kind of always the one to make like the edgy racial jokes back in middle school. And we actually had him organize this Black Lives Matter protest, and you know, it just seemed like he was sort of a microcosm to, you know, what's going on in the country in general. I don't know if you wanted to speak more about that, because I think we had some pretty good thoughts the other night that we were discussing just about attending that protest and, you know, what it meant.
Yeah, it was, that protest was really interesting, because I remember, I think it shows that, you know, I think that it shows that a lot of the time when the left attempts to, like, be a little heavy-handed with their like censorship of like humor and stuff, I think that it sort of shows that a lot of the time they're not actually right about the people that they're calling a racist, because I think that if they had heard him in high school, they probably would have figured that you know, the guy having that protest was like just a total racist. But you know, here he is, like it was a few years later, and he's organizing a BLM protest. So I think that that's one interesting takeaway. And secondly, I remember wanting to attempt to interject like more solution-oriented kind of posters. So I brought one that said, demilitarize the police state.
Right. Wasn't the other one about like victimless crime laws as well?
Yeah, and then I had one about trying to repeal victimless crime laws.
And then you had a third poster rather that said like, this is controlled opposition.
Yeah, that was sort of the troll poster, but I didn't want to take it out because I like the guy who was
right.
who was organizing the protest.
And this is in no way like an insult to this guy's character. This is no way, you know. So I think we all kind of go through, you know, the current liberal, like hard left type of social interactions that we're forced to have with a bit of resentment, and, you know, to make an edgy joke that pushes on offensive, that, you know, it can feel quite liberating for some people, and it's an interesting sort of inverse reaction to what these social planners and leftists had hoped would happen. And it was just very interesting to see, someone that if you heard him make jokes in like the 8th grade, you'd be like, oh, what a, if you were a leftist, you'd be like, oh, this guy's racist, he's insensitive. But it was just funny that he brought sort of this like white community together to protest for what's been made a race issue. It's actually a much larger brutality issue, a much larger power issue. And I thought that whole sort of line of conversation that we had was interesting. And why I thought kind of this situation was sort of a microcosm for what's going on around the country. And yeah,
and I think what you're kind of doing is you're like scooping up all of these people who definitely care about these issues, but you're attempting to put like a box around it into like this one sort of, I guess, mainstream articulation of resentment against the police. And the problem is that because all of it has to be under this sort of banner of Black Lives Matter. And this is the thing, I don't even necessarily think that it's not a race issue. I think that there definitely is a racial component.
Sure.
Like, of course, like, I think the police do definitely target minorities, like, more than white people, and that should definitely be addressed. But I think we've definitely discussed this before, that the problem with making it the sole issue seems to be that when you kind of put Black Lives Matter as like this is the social movement that's going to be fighting police brutality, well, the problem is that they don't really seem to actually have legitimate solutions, and all their solutions are basically, or at least a lot of the time, it's like, well, you have to get white people to check their privilege. And it's like, okay, so cops check their privilege and then start like pounding other white guys into the pavement. Right. It's like, it's not really a solution to the actual problem of brutality.
Right. And also a lot of these confrontations with police, I would say there's probably a good 10, maybe 20% of cops who actually do think, they see like a black man, or like, oh, he's up to no good, But the rest of them, what they're seeing is, unregulated economic transaction, like with Eric Garner, for example, reselling cigarettes. Must enforce, state control of economy, can't have free market. And that's what starts these interactions. And of course, you'll never get these people in the streets right now to hold a sign, like the freer the market, the freer the people, or something like that. But we really have to acknowledge, if we're going to make this sort of like a single issue thing, what all of these interactions with police have in common is that they started with a black market thing that was going on, whether it was Michael Brown with the cigars, Eric Garner with the cigarettes, George Floyd with his check. This is the state trying to stamp out a group of people's economic, means, because they're afraid of unregulated markets. And really, I don't see anyone making that intellectual leap, really. They end it with, they all happen to be black. It's like, how about the countless numbers of, other groups of people on a daily basis that are, attacked by the police because they're not, paying the max amount of taxes they could pay, or, they don't have like the right zoning permission to operate their business, or they don't have a bathroom in their business, or something. All these ridiculous things. And, it's just insane that people aren't talking about this. And, yeah.
Right, yeah. I mean, Duncan Lemp, who I believe it was a red flag law. The cops got tipped off that he might have an illegal gun.
Yeah.
And they, the guy was white, and they broke into his house in the middle of the night, no-knock raid, and shot him while he was sleeping. And I think that sort of stuff, is happening, way too often, and way more than it should be.
Or like Ross Ulbricht, the Silk Road guy, they found that he had created the Silk Road, and he's in prison for at least 80 years now because they're just trying to, quote, make an example out of him. And it's like, in this case, not to be too tangential, but people are obviously going to want to explore their own consciousness, and a lot of the controlled substances really shouldn't be controlled by the state. And, no one's talking about that case. No one's talking about, the state using, like, extra impunity, really going after one guy for no reason other than to make an example, And I don't hear conversation about that. And obviously, this killing was there for everyone to see. And if you're surprised by this killing, then, you really know nothing about how violent the state actually is against all groups of people.
Right, yeah, and they're not talking about certain issues like, I think you just brought up there briefly, the war on drugs,
Right.
for example. And I think that is one of the biggest pieces of legislation that we should really be going after if you want to start. And this could even be like, because I know the left a lot of the time, and this is why I sort of don't take the left-wingers seriously when they start talking about wanting to get rid of the police state, is because they tend to completely rely on them because they want the economic regulations, because they think that it keeps them safe. I mean, it doesn't, but that's what they think.
Right.
They want the state to enforce mandatory free healthcare. They want to have the state enforce welfare, and all of these sorts of things that the state actually does not do very well and actually makes worse most of the time. They want all these things enforced, and the police the police are necessary to enforce those things. So it's like, I think somewhat of it's intellectual dishonesty not to understand that you can't have government healthcare and no police department, or hate the police while wanting them to steal other people's money and give it to these various programs. But the war on drugs, though, is at least one thing that the left and right, at least the libertarian variants of both, I think could agree on.
Right. And you also, on the whole train of you can't do this while simultaneously doing this, we were also talking about the transition in America from, you have a group of people dealing with Jim Crow law, and then, you finally end that, and then you hit them with war on drugs, the sort of perpetual welfare state, and there's been no chance for the African American community to thrive in this country because this sort of, you have these Messiah-like liberals, or these liberals of the Messiah complex, saying, oh, we know what's best, we know what policies are going to help your race the most. And they won't bother to, address the consequences of their actions, and they won't hear valid criticism of, Section 9 housing, for example, or, these horrible living conditions that entire groups of people have been forced back into. We have not gotten rid of Jim Crowism. Instead, we've put a big smiley face on it, and we put the whole phrase it's for your own good there. And I find it really creepy and ironic that these leftists are saying, all right, well, let's defund the police, but let's keep refunding Planned Parenthood. If you look at Planned Parenthood's foundation, literally it was a eugenics program for inner city black people. They wanted to reduce the African American population in this country, and it's just freaky to see that coming back now. And people, of course, they're not going to connect the dots here. They're not going to, for fear of offending anyone. But it's that's not offensive. It's literally looking out for a group of people, saying, "Hey, look, the state has used your, lack of privilege back in the day, or the false start that your group has had, and is just keeping you in that perpetual false start, the victimhood mindset. And, to speak out against that is considered racism, and it's just absolutely insane, in my opinion.
Yeah, and this is sort of, I think that this is actually, I guess, sort of the problem with a lot of the social justice movement in general, is that our criticisms of left-wing ideas and ideology and programs, which are coming from a good place, and clearly we're legitimately attempting to we want to help the poor, we want to help disenfranchised groups, and it, from most of what we can tell, like, given all the data, more freedom and less government. The less government you have, the better off everyone's going to be, and especially going to be better off for more disenfranchised groups. But the problem is social justice and these sorts of ideas, a lot of the time, they want to silence our opinions along with actual racists, and the problem is that if we're not allowed to have these sort of tough discussions that might, like, maybe offend some people, especially like white leftists for the most part, if we're not able to have these conversations and actually attempt to get to the bottom of these problems, like, hey, well, maybe the welfare state isn't such a good thing for poor people, maybe affirmative action isn't actually a good thing for most people, because there's plenty of evidence to suggest that actually harms the people that it's attempting to help.
Right.
And just those very ideas and talking about them are automatically often considered, like, not necessarily racist, but, well, that's sort of a privileged opinion because of your socioeconomic class. It's like, well, yeah, but have you actually looked into the data? Or are you just fucking blathering? Are you just like, a chatterbox for this, like, moronic ideology, and you haven't actually looked into what those policies actually do? And I'm thinking it's the latter, because those policies don't work, and anyone with, like, a half-functioning brain can tell those policies are not effective and do not work.
Right. And it's just, I always find it funny, these leftists, their big, like, intellectual movement of the last, like, 30 years or so is like, oh, you gotta check your privilege, because, there's some people out there and they haven't had your economic situation. You ever think about that? And, like, it's supposed to, like, blow our minds, and we're supposed to, like, get on our knees and be like, oh my god, I'd never thought about that. Like, no, duh. Like, obviously, But as someone who has come from, like, Section 9 housing, who has come from, like, the really bad parts of the city, like, it's state funded, the liberals, they had the government build up these programs, and now they kind of left them on autopilot, assuming that that's, like, the best course of action for a group of people. And I think there could be no greater racism than that. I'd rather have someone just be overtly racist and say, I don't like your kind, than, oh yeah, I love your kind, and what you guys need is this, because me and this committee of, like, scientific planners, like Margaret Sanger and George Bernard Shaw, we've all determined that, your group, your race needs this X amount of welfare, and you need X amount of housing, and, like, that is fucked up, man. Like, that is so messed up. And I think partially, like, that's why things got so violent, as quickly as they did. People didn't even quite realize it. And, you see things like COVID-19, like, literally destroying entire populations of, like, inner city black people because they're stuck in these, like, dangerous government-funded housing situations. And, sort of held in these areas by, welfare and things like that. But, and of course, there's obviously, like, more nuances and complexities than what I'm saying. But just from my observation as someone who has come from that entire environment, the prescription of the 1960s, or, let's build housing for these groups of people, has failed. The welfare state has failed. It has not addressed any of the social or economic needs of an entire group of people. And all it's done is it's caused more marginalization in cities. We have business and capital now moving away from these government-sanctioned parts of our cities, and it's just further alienating an entire group of people, and no one's talking about this. I mean, there's a few people talking about this, but they're accused of being racist, and it's, just do some homework. Do your homework. Like, what we've been doing has not worked, and,
right.
This sort of mob boss, Democrat and Republican parties, like, I'll provide you housing if you give me your vote. That's not sustainable. That's not how you grow as a people. That's not how you gain rights. When you're constantly at the whim of the state, and members of your group are constantly being killed, like you're not gaining rights. And this is honestly, as I was saying before, sort of the worst form of racism, that this sort of smug liberal, like, oh, well, I voted and I took care of the problem, so it's good, racism over, or, oh, I changed my profile picture.
Posted a black square.
Yeah, I posted a black square, or, oh man, I donated 10 cents to like this weird like website, which it's probably going to like the DNC and Biden campaign at this point. Like, it's not going to these communities. And if you really want to stand against racism, get your ass out there and like stand in the streets, but bring a mask, bring stuff to fight against tear gas.
Right. And I mean, another thing to point out, the only reason why there's a disproportionate amount of black people on welfare is that at the time, right when they were becoming, they had been second-class citizens in this country because of Jim Crow laws. These government regulations were like holding them back, and the country at the time as well definitely did have a lot of racial prejudice. So when we got rid of the Jim Crow laws, things were actually really looking up. You kind of saw the economic, actually the entire time, the economic prosperity of black people had been rising.
Mm-hmm.
And then basically Lyndon Johnson in his Great Society, he brought in the welfare state in order to sort of knock out poverty. So the problem is that right on the precipice of this group who had been, completely marginalized by the white majority, then this white president brings in the welfare state, and basically this group who, in their mind, they're thinking, well, this country has completely fucked me over for my entire life. I've been, like, kicked around by the white man. Like, I might as well take his money because, like, he hasn't done anything else for me.
True.
And, like, I completely understand that perspective, but it just really sucks because no one really talks about the negative psychological impact of welfare on people and how it, like, kind of, it fixes you in this sort of unproductive state where you don't really care about manifesting your purpose because you're already kind of good, but it's not really fulfilling, and it's not really scary at the same time. It's just like sort of this horrible, like, entrapping you in mediocrity. And I feel like that's sort of I mean, because I was debating with my my left-wing friend, and they were saying, oh, well, see, this is actually kind of like a dog whistle, or like this is actually sort of right-wingers trying to get away with being racist. And it's like, well, no, it has nothing to do with being racist or like that black people necessarily want welfare more. That's obviously not the case. It's the fact that literally as you're becoming a first-class citizen, like right when you're getting rid of the Jim Crow laws, then you suddenly spring this thing, you suddenly enact welfare, and they had been like completely fucked over by society. Why on earth wouldn't you take free money?
Right. And also, like, you can't you can't forget rather the motives of some of the people who were passing things like the Civil Rights Act and various like things like the Great Society. One of the biggest, or a relatively famous quote by Lyndon Johnson, like as he was signing the Civil Rights Act bill, was that I'll have all of these blanks voting Democratic for the next 200 years. Like, this did not come from a peachy, feel-good place, and to critique it, being called a racist is just, or to be called racist for critiquing it, just it blows my mind, because you know, the people passing the laws did not have good intent for, you know, this group of people. They wanted them voting along the party line. They wanted a malleable class of people, you know, constantly in struggle, you know, as opposed to people who are, you know, well-to-do, you know, people who may not be voting for their lives, you know, and that's what they want. They want a group of people that are voting for their lives, and, you know, basically the entire structure of their community depends on who's in office. And, you know, as an anarchist, that just disgusts me. As a human being, you know, there should be no group of people that dependent upon the state. And, you know, the fact, it's such a weird, mutually toxic relationship, you know, inner city folks and the state. And so, you know, I see a lot of pushes for defunding the police, the abolition of the police, and I'm all for, you know, training police officers if we absolutely must have a police force, you know, train them in mental health and things like that. But if we're going to defund the police, we might as well start to wean off of the welfare state. We might as well start to defund the military. We might as well, you know, and defunding all kinds of other alphabet soup organizations that are contributing to the systemic oppression of people of color. You know, you want to talk about racism, look at what the CIA and Department of Defense are doing overseas to, you know, Muslims and people of color in the Middle East. You know, we've been drone bombing them for the last, you know, 20 or so years with impunity. You know, we've killed millions of people, and, you know, these same people who are running around the streets right now, you know, calling people like us racist and monsters, did not have the balls to call out like Barack Obama when he had the indiscriminate drone campaign in the Middle East, which, you know, killed thousands of children and, you know, has shattered an entire group of people. You know, there was none of this outrage there. So, you know, if we're going to shift more towards community policing, if we're going to shift more towards, you know, community awareness, we really have to start, you know, as people bringing up where the state has failed us. You know, instead of asking for, you know, less brutal government and more government in general, let's just start asking for less government and more, you know, community-based help, as opposed to, you know, because my fear is we're going to transition away from the more brutal police, and we're going to have these sort of like gentle, quote-unquote gentle, like authoritarian police. So we're literally going to go from a 1984 where the state's kicking the crap at you, it's perpetually at war, to a Brave New World where the state's giving you soma, and, you know, you're happy-go-lucky, and, you know, your mental health is always great, and you're never struggling, and, you know.
Right.
That was a bit of a ramble on my part, but I definitely see us going in that direction, because you can never trust what these social planners are doing.
Right, you know, until the entire system collapses.
Right. And so, yeah, where do you think we go from here, though, you know, as we hear more cries to defund the police? Do you think we go in a more positive direction, or do you think we go into like a more negative direction? And if so, how could we potentially prevent, like, I guess, a more negative direction? I guess as we start to wrap up here, it's almost been about an hour.
Right. I think honestly what you're gonna see is you're basically gonna see a bunch of cities doing this sort of virtue signaling type of nonsense. A lot of them aren't gonna try to change anything, I think. You know, and you kind of see that with the Black Lives Matter, what is it, Black Lives Matter Boulevard, is that it?
Yeah, the Boulevard of Broken Policies. No.
Right, so there's like, they painted the street like Black Lives Matter, and then you also had, they're taking down like Confederate statues and stuff. And it's just all this like virtue signaling nonsense that doesn't really actually deal with any issues of like, oh well, look, like, you know, the state is you know, perpetually aggressing against a lot of people. Maybe that's something we should deal with. Yeah. But no, they want to deal with Confederate statues or whatever.
Right.
Which, you know, I don't know really where I fall on that issue specifically, but the problem with it is that it's not actually, they're selling you that as the solution, as if taking down a Confederate monument does anything. and they're basically using it as a thing to get people to like think, like as you said earlier, like basically think that, oh well, my job here is done, and to not actually push for real reform.
Right.
And then I think in the places that they do create reform, it's going to be the reforms are basically going to be either one, virtue signals, or two, bring these police forces basically under like higher federal control.
Okay.
So the federal government can kind of start like leaking in, essentially attempt to start like leaking in more almost like new forms of like propaganda. And this almost goes to what you're talking about earlier with the sort of more so Brave New World policing, but like almost getting them to, I would think actually like probably like, you know, let's say they bring in like mental health like professionals to deal with the police or whatever, and I feel like that's probably going to be one of the new tactics they're going to try to work with. I think what they're going to try to do is like retrain them to be like quote unquote like not racist or something, but I don't think that that's actually going to be the goal. I think there's going to be some form of like almost like brainwashing the police to conform to this new like broader society where the federal government is, you know, the federal government is king, and you know, basically taking even more power away from the states.
Right. And if you think about it too, you know, police officers are citizens, and if you think about the second largest group of armed citizenry, you know, it technically is the police officers. And so these astroturfed demands to abolish and defund police officers, you're going to lose another line of defense, you know, if the government decides to go, you know, sort of balls to the wall, like crackdown mode on, you know, their own people. Because I know plenty of, you know, officers who, you know, if their oath is questioned, or not questioned, but if like the oath they initially took is broken, yeah, they'll fight back. In a sense, they are like 3%ers. And, you know, as much as I think a lot of 3%ers are kind of LARPers and, you know, aren't really ever going to go through with it, you know, as someone who is concerned about government overreach, it was comforting to know that there was at least a group of well-intentioned officers who, you know, if they actually really started to enforce unjust or, you know, sort of immoral laws, that they would be like, no, I took an oath to the Constitution. And, you know, obviously, as Lindsay or Spooner put it, the Constitution has either allowed the system we have to occur or it's been helpless to prevent it. And so in no regards am I a constitutionalist, but it was sort of a great leap forward in the cause of human liberty. And so I think that's really something we need to watch out for as well. There's probably going to be murmurings of a federal police force, or, you know, something like that, or oh well, the National Guard's been around long enough, and, you know, oh, they're a little less violent on their people and they have more oversight, direct ties like the federal government. Why don't we keep them around for a little longer? And that's really something we have to watch out for in the coming, you know, weeks as this goes on. And I think another thing we're going to have to watch out for is the growth of these sort of commune movements. You know, I think Seattle's just the beginning, but I can see other, you know, left-leaning cities like Oakland and like Portland, for example. I can see these becoming, you know, hotbeds of these sort of left-wing communes. And then, of course, we're going to have a proportional response from the right. You know, we'll probably have like Proud Boy types, you know, coming into these communes and trying to smash people over the head, or, you know, I hope not, but potentially armed conflicts. You know, and all the while, you know, like Donald Trump kind of cheering them on along the way. And, you know, I just think we're at a point where the boogeymen of communism and fascism have come out. You know, it's out of the bottle. You know, this murder, this police killing of George Floyd has awakened these two forces that you and I have been watching growing basically since like the early sort of 2010s. Like, that's when we became aware of it, but these forces have been growing since the 1930s themselves. with various social movements. And I think, honestly, I don't want to say we're at a point of no return. I think we could still turn like communities around and save them from this sort of totalitarianism that's coming. But we're definitely in, and I hate to use this phrase, but we're in a new normal. And the environment is radical enough to where now we have these communists and fascists debating communism and fascism instead of these sort of like single issue things. You had the left, it was built on single issue politics, and now they've all kind of congealed into, well, now we're radical socialists, we're Antifa. And the right, the same thing happened. They had a bunch of people single issue, and now they've congealed into, we're closed border, we're anyone that isn't in our tribe, that doesn't share our Western values, is an enemy. And I think really our job here, and the goal of this podcast is to preserve the Western ideals of liberty, and while also incorporating some of the Eastern ideals of like self-reflection and critical thinking and things like that. And it's going to be an uphill battle, and it's just gotten 10 times harder. But I think this is a unique time because there is still a lot of fresh frustration, and they haven't been able to fully define the anger that surrounded George Floyd's murder. And so I think this is a really critical point. And for anyone listening, it's time to really do your homework. It's time to read. It's time to educate yourself. And at times it's time to get out on the street and engage with your community. Talk to them about victimless crime laws. Talk to them about the police state. And then those types of conversations, if we can combine it with the energy of like the Black Lives Matter movement, we could really be dealing with a genuinely better police force. And that's kind of my final thoughts as we wrap up the podcast here. I don't know if you have anything else to say on that note.
Yeah, I guess the last thing I would just sort of want to go off from there is that it seems to me that in a way, a lot of the social justice stuff that comes out of a lot of these types of movements like BLM and whatever, I know that for most people it's coming from like a positive, like humanitarian place, and they legitimately want to help people who are disenfranchised. But I unfortunately have to say it that a lot of the sort of ideas that are coming out of a lot of the ideas that they're espousing are essentially subversively like communist ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And the issue is that you tend to be called like a conspiracy theorist, or that you align with like the alt-right or something, if you kind of bring that up, which is frustrating because that's just another tactic to get people to be silent about that you're attempting to smuggle communism. I mean, why do you think they're saying all that stuff? Like, oh, well, you're probably a fascist if you think that this is about communism. It's like, well, obviously, if you were attempting to smuggle communism in on racial issues, you would call anyone who called it out a fascist. So I think that people really need to start critically thinking about that sort of stuff more, because a lot of the way that this stuff is worded, a lot of the way that these movements are designed is purposefully designed to sort of destroy a lot of, like, I guess you could say, like, Enlightenment values.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it's really a coincidence that a lot of these ideas are being peddled by people on the left. It's just if you don't agree with me, I just really encourage you to really attempt to actually process the ideas, actually look at the ideas that they're talking about, and actually like think about it for a little bit more than like a minute, because fundamentally a lot of the social justice sort of ideas basically imply that there is actually no solution, and that fundamentally like the differing races actually can't get along, and that is basically fundamentally baked into a lot of their catchphrases.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll go into more examples of this maybe I think I might do a solo video like maybe next week or whatever. Sure. Or if Fran wants to like do another video specifically on cultural Marxism, I will be coming out with something I think in the relatively near future, but for now, like, it's just kind of important. I want to see if the listeners can like look through these ideas and kind of see how the logical conclusions of them basically almost necessarily mean that racial groups can't get along if you take social justice's like conclusions to their logical end. And I think that that's really disturbing because ideally everyone, races should get along, and I think that through free markets, it's literally about mutual benefit. Exactly. It's about trade. It's about like people from completely different backgrounds being able to come together through voluntary interaction, through trade, through and that's why we can go to like restaurants of from styles of food that are from completely different countries. Right. Or from completely different people. And that's why we can like go there and enjoy other cultures, and it really seems to me that there's this idea baked into a lot of identity, like modern identity politics and politically correct culture, that is actually saying, well, no, that's basically wrong. We need to revolt and instill Marxism to get rid of this, or else the races cannot get along. And I think that is complete fucking horse shit. I think it would actually exacerbate race relations, to be perfectly honest.
Right, and I think to put a bow on all this, there's going to be 3 pieces of advice. Reject conflict theory, because we can as a species coexist peacefully. The fact that we're in a building that I pay rent for every month, that's powered by an electrical company that my landlord pays, proves that. The second, I reject identity politics, because once any group starts organizing their politics around their identity, it raises the stakes for every other group to do the same. And then my third and final point is, if you must burn down a business during this point, because I think a lot of different protests or forms of protests are valid, just target the ones that are the most subsidized by your tax dollars. I'm talking about the big chain stores, the big mortar and brick stores. Not your mom and pop businesses. Those are the real capitalists, and those are the ones that are trying to compete in this horribly unfair market where you have a group of cronies that have a really tight relationship with the state that are controlling the economy. And I think that's it for me.
Yeah, and with that, until next time, folks, viva la revolution.
Yeah, it's gonna be a long, hot summer.